thankful to have this opportunity to give a talk on Django translations, and specifically about an app that I translated for my family. So my name is Pandy, Andrew Knight for long. I am the lead software engineer and test at a company called Precision Lender. We make a web app that helps banks make smarter loans. You can follow me on Twitter at Automation Panda. You can read my blog at automationpanda.com. What I'm going to talk about tonight has nothing to do with my day job. It's more of what I've done moonlighting. So I love Python and I love the Django framework. My wife and her mom run a small sales business. My wife is very entrepreneurial. I love her very much. We used to import things and export things. The reason why you see a whole rack of wedding dresses behind me is because we used to import those. And so my wife used to track all these things in a big, scary spreadsheet. And anyone who knows, when you dive deep enough into a business that you hit the big, scary spreadsheet, that's an opportunity for a better software solution. So when I saw this, I suggested, hey, why don't I try to develop something for you that can make your job a little bit easier? And so after comparing a bunch of solutions, thinking about it, I decided to build an order processing application for her and her mom using the Django framework. Because we were the only ones who were going to be using this site, I decided to make the admin site for the Django app as our front end. It generates all the data models for us. All the customers, all the orders were just data models in the ORM. We could make actions in the admin site, submit forms, beautiful. To host it, I put it up on Heroku. It was very, very easy just to take your code and go, here you go. And that way they could access it. I even had a mini pipeline where I went from staging to a production, staging for myself to test, production for them to actually use. And we even were able to upload image files and store them in Amazon S3. Now, the more interesting dynamic of this is that my wife and her mom are from China. I'm from America. I'm originally from Baltimore, but I live in North Carolina now. And my wife is the only bilingual one in our family. I can speak a little bit of Chinese. And Mama can speak a little bit of English, but at home, our language is Chinglish. And so I needed to be able to translate this entire application I developed from English to Chinese so that everyone in my family could use it to help with the family business. So Django has a very, very nice translation framework inside of it. Django's batteries included. It gives you everything you need. And honestly, this was one of the major deciding factors for me to pick Django for the application that I developed, because it had that translation framework out of the box. Anytime you want to do translations in Django, it's really a 4-step process. The first 3 steps have to do with what we call internationalization, or I-18N. When I say internationalization, what I mean is the tools, framework, and processes that enable localization and translation. So it's very much a framework level thing or a tools type of thing. So for internationalization, Django has 3 steps, so to speak. First, you add some settings to your application. Secondly, you add proper routing for your translation pages. And third, you mark all of your strings for translation. The 4th step is what we call localization. Localization would be the artifacts of localizing or translating or preparing your application for a locale or a region. So for us, we had 2 locales. We had American English and we had simplified Mandarin Chinese. Locales typically refer to languages when we think about them, but they can also refer to things like date and time formatting. Even more broadly, they can refer to special changes you have to make in your application in order to meet, let's say, cultural expectations for whatever your locale is. So I'm going to go over these 4 steps in this talk tonight, and then we can maybe have a little time for question and answer. If there's anything that you want to dig deeper into, I highly recommend reading the translation docs on Django, because most of what I'm going to talk about tonight, I've read there, learned from there, and tried it out the hard way myself. So first of all, we have to set some things in our settings.py file. Some of these are mandatory, some of them are required. I'll try to explain the best as I can for what I know. First thing I recommend you set is the locale middleware. This is something that is optional, but something that is highly recommended. Excuse me. If you add the locale middleware, then Django will automatically try to translate your page based on the context in which the page is requested. So we want to put the locale middleware after the session middleware because it uses the session. But we want to put it before the common middleware because the common middleware uses URL prefixes. So if the order is important here, if we put it here, then the locale middleware will check for your language preference in the following order. First of all, it will look for a URL language prefix. And we'll talk about the language prefix in the URL in a slide or two. That's the most direct way to say, I want this page in this language. If there is no URL language prefix, the second thing it will look for is the language cookie. If there's no language cookie, then it will look in your request for the accept language HTTP header. And if that's not given, it'll fall back on what your default language is, given by another setting called language code. Oops. So some more settings we can or should add. First of all would be that language code. The language code sets the default language, and it must be in the accept language HTTP header code formats. So for my application, I wanted American English to be the default language. And so the language code for that is lowercase en-us. If you're not sure what your language codes are, you can always just search accept language HTTP header code. I think you'll probably land a Wikipedia page that has a whole bunch of them. The next settings we want to set are these two use settings. There's use I18N, which when we set that to true, will enable translations to happen. And then there's also use L10N. When we set that to true, it'll format dates and numbers according to the locale. Small note, if you know for a fact that you are not going to do any translations, you can set both of these to false to get a small performance boost. The next setting that I recommend, it's not required, is the languages setting. The languages setting is a list that limits the available languages for translation. In my application, I wanted to limit that to English and simplify Chinese. If I did not set this languages setting, potentially what could happen is that somebody could type out a URL with a language code that your application does not support, and that would not work well for them. Most likely what would happen is it would fall back on the default language because it can't find the desired language, and that will come across as seemingly a bug to your end user. If you use this languages setting, it will, I believe, show an error message saying, hey, that particular language isn't supported, or will give you some sort of thing like that. So it's explicitly setting the languages that you support is a very, very good design decision, in my opinion. In Python, we prefer to be explicit rather than implicit. And finally, another setting I recommend you set is the locale paths setting. Locale paths specifies the directories where you will place your language files. And we'll talk about the language files or the messages files in a few slides. Those are the files that actually have the translations for you. If you do not specify this, by default, Django will look for a locale directory in each of your application folders. If you leave it like that, you can specify translations on a per app basis. However, for my application, there were lots of strings that were shared across my different Django apps. And so I just wanted one locale directory off the base directory that just had everything. And so that's what I set here. If you're just doing a one-off app, it's probably okay to do. You could also specify other paths as well, and you can specify multiples. So again, like I said, a lot of these are things that I recommend to make your application's translations a bit easier to manage. Next, let's talk about URL language prefixes. So you don't need to have language prefixes in your URLs, but like I said, I find them to be very, very helpful and intuitive. The way a language prefix works is you'll have your https://, you'll have your domain name, myapplication.com, whatever. Then before you have the rest of the resource path, the URL language code can be prefixed. So if I had /en/ whatever my page is, that's specifying English, that would go to an English page. If I have zh-hans/resource path, that'll go to a simplified Chinese page. Now, side note, you may be wondering, how in the world did zh-hans mean Chinese? Little bit of thing, if you know any Chinese and you know pinyin, the romanization system, ZH is short for Zhong, which in Chinese, the name for China, the country, is Zhongguo, which means Middle Kingdom. So ZHONG is Zhong, that's syllables. That's where the ZH comes from for the Chinese language code. The Han for the Han script, and then the S for simplified characters, which is what they use in the mainland, versus T, which for traditional characters that they use in Taiwan and Hong Kong. So little interesting language code backstory there. Anywho, so you can explicitly set your language codes and explicitly get the pages that you desire. Now, if you don't specify a language code, a best practice is, by default, it should peel over to your default language, which in my case, I want it to be English. So boom, that's how that would go through. Setting this up is super easy in Django. Django's batteries included, whole thing is just boom out the box. So in the file or in the module where you specify your URLs, you probably have some sort of URLs patterns list that has a whole bunch of paths in it. All you got to do is wrap that list in this function called i18n patterns that comes from the Django conf URLs i18n module. And you just put all your paths in like you would otherwise. This function acts like nothing more than a wrapper. And so it wraps, in a sense, those prefixes around your paths. Now, there's one more setting you want to add to this at the very bottom. You want to add prefix default language equals false, as shown here, so that if no prefix is given, it will fail over to use the default language. If you don't specify this here, or you set it to true, then it's going to require that prefix. That's all you got to do to get prefix routing. Third part to our translation workflow, and this is by far the most painful because it's the most grind work. We need to mark every single string that we want to translate in the app. Every single string. There's no free lunch. Anything that will be made visible publicly to an end user on the screen, whether that's in a model or in a view or wherever, in a template, we need to explicitly mark that for translation. So here's a basic example where we have, let's just say, a view function that's returning an HTTP response. From the Django utils translation package, we want to import a function called getText. And it's very, very common practice to import that with an alias of the underscore, because it's much easier to type underscore a bajillion times than to type getText a billion times. And so all we do is, you can see here by red boxes, we are wrapping that string, welcome to my site. When you call the getText function, it will do an immediate evaluation and translation wherever that is called. And then it will return a string that is translated. And so output is now a string, and that gets returned into your response. This is the basic case. There is also a lazy form of translation. It's a little bit more advanced than your basic translation. Lazy translations are done when the string is accessed in context, not when the translation function is called. When you call the getText_lazy function instead of the plain getText function, they come from the same module. Instead of directly returning a string, I believe it returns some sort of funky string, for lack of a technical term. You can inspect it with Python and all. But what that thing is, it's an object, and it won't do the translation until it is being called in context, meaning until it is being displayed in a view or something. And that's important because when it comes to, say, your models, you don't necessarily want to translate your models fields right when they are loaded. You want to translate them in context because of the timing of things and the execution of your Django app. And so models are the perfect case where you don't really want to use getText, you want to use getTextLazy. And so here's an example of that. I have my thing model and all the different fields in there, whether it's the name, the help text, or even the metadata. I can wrap that with lazy translations and it'll work out okay. You may be wondering when you would want to translate a model. The best case scenario I can give would be the admin site, because that's what I had to translate. Another note is that as far as I'm aware, I don't think there's any harm other than maybe a small performance hit to doing lazy translations for everything other than just direct getText translations. I could be wrong on that, but every time in my code base, I just default to just everything getTextLazy so I don't shoot myself in the foot. Because I have shot myself in the foot and pulled my hair out for an hour, wondering why the heck these things didn't translate, and then tried lazy and it worked. So, brute force method. In addition to translating your Python code, you can also translate your template code. Use the trans tag inside of your templates, and any string literal or even variable values can be translated. Be careful with variables though, because they may not necessarily get picked up in your translation files automatically when make messages does its scan. We'll see that in a little bit. So we can just wrap anything in the trans tag. We can also put in a little no op if we want to put the trans tag in, but don't want the translations to happen yet. That's kind of like a work in progress sort of scenario. And if we have a lot of text we need to translate, then you can use a block trans tag. And you can even do interpolation, as I've shown here, which is pretty cool. Finally, step 4, now that we've done all the internationalization stuff, we've prepared our application code, we've marked all those strings. Step 4 is time to generate those locale files. With the Django framework, what we'll need to do, first of all, we need to discover all of these strings that we've marked for translation in our code base. And then once we have them, we provide the translations themselves and then compile them. So the first step is making the message files, and that's the discovery phase. So we use the following command: Python manage py make messages, kind of like make message files. And then with the -l option, we want to provide locale codes for all of the locales into which we wish to translate our application. So this command will search for all translatable strings in the Django code, whether that's Python code or template code. Then it will either create a new language file under your locale paths directory if there's no locale file already existing, or if there is no locale file existing, or if there is a previously existing locale file, it will add the newly discovered strings to translate to that language file. So the first time generates a new one. Every time after that, it just kind of adds. It won't ever take anything away, thank goodness, but it will add the new ones. Warning here, this command needs a locale name, not a language code. So zh-hans with lowercase is not the same as zh_H Hans. That was another hour or two I burned pulling my hair out, wondering why this didn't work. I don't know why locale codes and language codes are different, but they are. Be aware of that. So once I run this make messages command, it'll pop out a bunch of .po language files. Now you might be thinking, ooh, so Django is going to provide, English to Spanish or English to Chinese for me. No, it'll provide a message file where it has a bunch of message ID strings in the language in which you wrote, and all those message str strings directly under there, which provide the translations, will be empty strings. And so you or someone that you know or trust or hire we'll need to provide the translations for all those words and phrases into that message file. So for myself, there were many an evening on the couch where I would be developing away. I'd generate the language file, hand the laptop over to my wife, and she would type out all of the translations for me. So this file is a very basic format. Anything with a hashtag will be commented. Message ID to message string are the language 1 to language 2 mappings. That's where the translation actually happens. Anything marked with a hashtag comma fuzzy will be ignored. Sometimes those will appear if Django thinks it has a matching translation, but it's not quite convinced. Anytime there's an empty message string value, that translation will be skipped and Django will just show the original string. Or if there's a string that's marked for translation in the code, but has a missing message ID in the file, that will also not be translated. So just be aware of those cases. Once you've provided all of the translations in the .po files for all the locales you want, then you run the following command, python manage py compile messages. And this will convert your .po files into .mo files that Django can use. And these MO files are basically like static assets, HTML files, CSS, JavaScript, whatever. And so you'll need to treat them like static assets. Wherever you deploy your Django application, you'll need to carry them with you because Django will look for these .mo files in whatever your locale directory path is. And so that's where it will go to say, okay, I need translations at runtime. Let me pull them from here, boom, boom. Now you can see Chinese or Spanish or French, whatever language you choose. So that's basically all there is to Django translations. There's a bit more nuance to things like how can you interpolate values? How do you handle plurals? You can wage wars over, do you want to translate long strings versus individual words and phrases? I won't get too much into that detail. If you want to learn more, you can check out the Django docs, as I said. Also, I gave the full version of this talk online for PyCon 2020, and that video has been uploaded, or it is available on YouTube today. So if you go to PyCon 2020's website, go to their online page, you'll see all of the available talks and tutorials, and you'll see East meets West when translating Django apps. So please give that a like, give that a watch. You may be wondering why translations are important. I know, this is a Django meetup, but translations are a bit of a niche topic. They are important. We live in an ever increasingly globalized world, and translations should help bring us as people around the world together. Accessibility in terms of language is very important. I live this every day in my family when my mother-in-law and I struggle to communicate, but we figure it out. So keep that in mind as you develop your apps. So thank you so much for inviting me again. I really appreciate it. Like I said, you can follow me on Automation Panda, or you can follow me on Twitter at Automation Panda, and you can read my blog at automationpanda.com.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Do you have any time to pick up any questions from the Q&A section?
Sure, let's do it. Why can I not view questions? One moment. There we go. Okay, I had to exit full screen. So one question, how about URLs in Chinese or Greek? Man, I have no idea. I'm assuming that URLs would allow special characters like that, but I'm not exactly sure. I've never seen that in a URL. Well, I know special characters a lot of times are escaped in URLs. So if you're talking about translating URLs, that would be a different thing altogether. I don't think Django has an out-of-the-box way to translate URLs, though you could probably set something up. Okay. SEO best practices with multiple languages. Truth be told, I have no idea. I'm not a SEO person. I'm sorry. Does prefix routing work with the same with Django REST framework? Honestly, I don't know, but I presume that it would. I don't see why it wouldn't. com/ whole bunch of Chinese characters. Cool. Okay. Here we go. In the PO files, there is a reference to the line of code where that message is. So what if we change the line of code where we want to translate? Great question. So yes, that, as you probably saw in the PO file, there is a line reference as well as the module name. So if you have one string that appears in multiple files, in the comments in your PO file, it'll show every place that thing appears. If you happen to change that line of code, when you go to regenerate your messages files, those comments get updated as well. So as long as you're keeping your messages up to date and synced, that shouldn't be an issue. Oops. Let's see some more questions here. Does Django also translate variables? That's a bit of a loaded question. When we say variables, are we saying like, can you put a variable in a string marked for translation? The answer to that is yes, you can do that. And I showed that in the template code. You can also do that in the Python code. The only thing I would very, very strongly caution you about trying to translate variables is that those are not picked up for translation by the make messages command. So if you put in a variable and say, hey, translate this string with this variable expression, or even just a general expression, we can say, not just a variable, but an expression. Whatever the possible strings that variable could lead to, you as the developer will need to explicitly go into your message file and add entries for all of those, or else the translation won't work. Django translations in JavaScript. I suppose if your JavaScript was in a template, you could templatize it there. As far as like doing translations in JavaScript, I mean, your JavaScript files are going to be kind of separate from your Django and your Python stuff. So not sure what the integration would be there. Thanks, your help taught me a lot. You just described how to translate the static string. How about translation in the table that are dynamic different for each object? That goes back to what I was saying before. If anytime you have an expression that you're trying to translate, string equals some sort of expression thing, you'll need to know that what all the different possibilities of that outcome are, and then put those translations in there. I will also shout out, look into the interpolation, because if you're trying to translate the phrase, I have 7 apples, right? You can interpolate the digit for that 7 and translate, I have however many number of apples. And so when you do the translation of that, it'll have a placeholder for whatever you were trying to interpolate, and then you can translate around that and substitute back in.
Andrew, thanks a lot. This talk was great. Can you explain the origination of your handle? Where did Automation Panda come from?
Oh my gosh. So I first started blogging at the beginning of 2017, and I'm a software engineer test. So I do a lot of testing, automation, BDD. I do Python on the side. And I can be a full-blown developer if I want. But I kind of hone in on testing and automation. And so when I started my blog, I was like, okay, well, I better get on Twitter because I see that's what other people do. So I wanted the names to match. I tried coming up with something catchy. Like, nobody knows Andy Knight, but what is something that people will remember? What is something that people love? Because not everyone loves automation, but everyone loves pandas. And I love pandas. So I'm like, Automation Panda. That sounds kind of cool. Boom, it happened. And so, yeah.
It totally makes sense. Awesome.
Yep.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Really appreciate it.